Good afternoon, good evening, or good night, wherever you're joining from, and welcome to the RAD Lectures, where we will be installing Arch Linux with the Cosmic desktop environment. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and before you ask, why would you not just use the Arch install script, which is a valid question, and it does have a time and a place, I like to have complete control over my system and really understand how it works. And during this tutorial, you're going to understand how your Arch Linux installation works, and you'll know your PC or your machine better than ever. So just a bit before we get into it, in front of you is the Arch Linux installation guide, and we should always consult that when we install a fresh Arch instance. Throughout the video, I'm going to have little timestamps where you can refer to the certain sections within the Arch Linux installation guide so that you don't lose track. Now, before we get into it, there's just a few pieces of technology that I want to introduce at a high level. Now, the file system that we're going to be using is BTRFS or BTRFS, and it's a modern copy-on-write file system that has dynamic subvolumes, and it's really great. It also integrates really well with Timeshift. Timeshift is going to allow us to have snapshots so that we can restore our system in case we screw it up. It's also important to protect your data. So when it comes to encrypting your device, we're going to use cryptsetup with LUKS. And so I'll be stepping you through encrypting your disk with Arch. In the age of Electron apps and Chrome hogging all of your RAM, even devices with a lot of RAM sometimes struggle, and we come up against that memory. Now, ZRAM is an ingenious tool that compresses the memory which is inside your RAM, and so you can extract more out of it. Finally, System 76 is in the process of developing a new desktop environment called Cosmic. Now, if you're familiar with Pop! OS, you'll be familiar with the old version of the Cosmic desktop environment. They just released the Alpha 7, and we're going to be installing that. It's a wonderful desktop environment, and later this year we're going to see the beta release, so it's good to get ahead of the curve. In my opinion, it's definitely the #1 desktop environment, and it's certainly going to be going forward on Linux. Because this is quite a lengthy and involved tutorial, I've documented all of it on my GitHub, so if you do get lost, you can always refer to that, to the commands and everything like that. Now, before we get started, I'm going to ask you to do one thing. I need you to go ahead and prepare an installation medium. You can refer to the official Arch Linux guide, and I'll see you when we're going to boot into that ISO. All right, so you should have your Arch ISO loaded onto your device, and now you've got your target machine. In this case, I've got a T480 Lenovo ThinkPad. I recently rebuilt this, so if you're interested in taking a look, have a look at that video. I'll link it. But anyway, so let's insert this USB into the target device and just have a look at the instruction manual for your machine. I know that when I turn this machine on, F12 is the shortcut to enter into the boot menu. So I'm just going to tap on F12. Once we're in the boot menu, you're going to be presented with a few options. Now, I've previously had Windows installed on this machine and also Fedora, but the one that I'm actually interested in is this SanDisk Cruiser Blade, which is the name of the USB device that I've got the Arch ISO installed on. So I'm going to hit that one, and now this is going to boot us into the Arch ISO. Now, it's got a countdown here. It goes 15 seconds. It's going to automatically select the first option. So you can either let it time out or you can just hit enter. The one that we're interested in is the Arch Linux install medium. Great, so the Arch ISO has been loaded and we are logged in as root. Now, we're not yet operating on the target disk on the machine, we're just operating from that USB device, so don't remove it just yet. The first thing that I'm going to do so that you can all see it better is you may find that the font is very small the first time that you do this. So I'm going to run this command, it's set font, and then I'm going to say ter-1332b. All right, so you should be able to see that pretty clearly. next step is optional. For this tutorial, I'm going to be running this via SSH. So we're going to get an internet connection here, and then we're going to go back to the other machine, and we're going to SSH into this machine. The reason for that is just easier for you to see, but if you don't want SSH access to the machine, you can skip this step. But if you do, then just follow along. So the first thing that we want to do is we need to give our root user a password. This is a temporary password. It's going to no longer be pertinent. Once we have installed Arch onto our system, we're going to select a new password at this stage. But in order for SSH to be enabled, we need to have the password. So just run passwd and give it a password. Let's just say ABC. Retype it. Okay, so the password has been updated. Now, what we want to do is just make sure that the SSH daemon is running. The way that we do this is with systemctl, and then we're going to say status sshd. We can see that it's active and running. If yours is not running, then you can simply say start, and then you can run status again after that, and you'll see that it's running. All right, now it is important that we're on a UEFI boot system. So these instructions are for a UEFI system. The way that we can find that is with this command. We're going to cat a certain directory, and if we are on a UEFI system, then we will see some information and we can proceed. So it's in the sys sys directory, and then firmware, and then EFI, and then FW platform size. And we can see we are on 64. So that's 64-bit for the system that I'm operating on. And you can also download the 32 as well. But for this one, it looks good. If it doesn't look good, as you're not on a UEFI system, you can consult the Arch Linux documentation. It doesn't prevent you from installing Arch. This tutorial is just for such a system. Okay, so now what we need to do is we want to connect this target device, this machine that we're installing Arch on, to the internet. And the way that we can do that is with, there's a lot of different commands that you can use, or there's a lot of different tools rather. The one that I'm going to use is iwctl. So you can just write iwctl. And in here, we can have a look at the different devices that we have. So let's first run this station list, and we can see that we've got devices. And so, for example, my wireless network card is WLAN 0. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to see which networks are available, and we're going to connect to the network. You can, of course, at this stage also just plug in an Ethernet cable. That equally works. So station, and then I'm going to say WLAN 0 get networks, and then I'm going to say enter. And in here we can see there's a lot of networks available. Now, the one that I'm actually interested in is second from the top. That is Chiang Mai flag. So that's the one I'm going to connect to. The way that I do that is I just run station WLAN 0 connect, and then Chiang Mai flag underscore 2.4 GHZ. Now it's going to ask for a passphrase, so go ahead and enter your Wi-Fi password. Now we're just going to exit out of iwctl, and we're going to see if our connection is successful. So we can simply write exit and then hit enter. Now I'm going to clear the screen with the clear command. I'm going to use the ping tool, and I'm going to just do it for 5 counts. So this is automatically going to stop. And then we're going to go archlinux.org. That's just, you can use any website. And let's see. So we can see that it's pinging archlinux.org. And if we have a look here at the ping statistics, we can see that there were 5 packets transmitted, 5 received, 0% package loss. So we know that we've sent and received, therefore we are connected to the internet. Everything's looking pretty good. Now, In order to SSH in, if that's going to be the path that you're taking, just like I am, you're going to need your IP address. And so my IP address, I'm going to run this IP addr show. Okay, so in here we can see the IP address. It is, I'll highlight it on the screen because I don't have the mouse, but it's 192.168.1.12/24. Now I'm going to switch back to the other computer. Now that this device has internet access and we've created a password and we can see it on the network, I will proceed with the installation from there. Okay, so I'm back on my local work machine, and what I'm going to do now is I am going to connect remotely into the laptop behind us. Now, you can run the same commands directly on the laptop or you can SSH in. It's up to you. The commands are exactly the same. But in order to get into that machine, we're going to have to connect using SSH. So the way we're going to do that is we are going to write in the command SSH, and then it's going to be root because you want to be the root user, the user for which we've set up the password. And then you want to say the IP address. So in the case of mine, it was 192.168.1.12. Now you'll be asked to say, are you happy with the authenticity of this host? It's not a known key. In our case, we are, so just write in yes. And now it's going to ask you for the password for root. So in my case, that was ABC. That's a temporary password. We're going to create another password later when we need to encrypt the actual device over there. All right, so this looks pretty familiar. It's the same ISO loaded on that machine over there, and we are logged in as root. So we can proceed to the next part of the tutorial. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to want to do is you may not use a US keyboard. I use the US keyboard, right? But maybe you're from another country around the world, you don't. So the way that we're going to do that, we can have a look at all of the keymaps using the list keymaps in the locale CTL. So I'm going to clear this screen, and now we're going to say locale CTL and then list keymaps. And we can see there's tons in here. If we were to move down, you're going to recognize your country. We've got Germany, Czech, we've got Dvorak if you're into that, and so on and so forth. So choose the one that you want. I'm using US, and by default that is the one, but we can simply use Q to exit out of that, and we're going to write clear, or we can also use Control L. It's a bit quicker. And now I'm going to load the keys. So let's say I'm going to load keys, and then I would do DE just as an example. Now I also have the German key mapping, and in this case I know that the keys are going to be set to the German, but I'm going to put that now so you can see that the Y and the Z are swapped around. I'm going to load the US again, just for an example. So load up yours. Once we've done that, we know that this machine is connected to the internet, so we can actually set our time zone. We can once again have a look at the time zones, and I'm going to say time, date, CTL, and then list time zones. Now, I'm going to say grep. I'm going to use a pipe symbol, and I'm going to grep that into, and I'm going to put Bangkok because I know that's the time zone that I'm in. You could also, for example, or let's say we just put Asia. Now you could put Europe, you could put the other continents. Now for me, I'm in the Asia Bangkok time zone, but just so we can have a look, we can see there are plenty of time zones. I mean, it's a huge continent, but if we go up here, then we can see there's Bangkok. And funnily enough, it's in the same time zone here as Paru in Russia, but it doesn't matter. So I'm going to set my time zone, and the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to Control L, I'm going to clear. The way that we set the time zone is we say time, date, CTL, and then set time zone. And I'm going to say Asia, and then Bangkok. You can use tab to autocomplete. So there we go. I've set the time zone now. But I also want to put another setting in here, which is set NTP, which is the network time protocol. So it's going to keep in sync with the network. The way that we can do that is time date ctl and then set ntp and then true. Okay, so we have connected to the device, we've got the time set up, we've got the correct keyboard or key map. So now what we need to do is we need to identify the drive on that device that we want to install Arch on, and we need to partition it ready. So we're going to be using BTRFS, remember, and with BTRFS we only need 2 partitions. Of course, if you're going to be dual booting or you have other stuff going on, then you need to account for that. But in this example, we're just going to have 1 boot partition, an EFI partition, and then secondly, we're going to have 1 main partition. And so for the rest of this tutorial, I will refer to it as the boot partition or EFI partition, which is a small partition. And then on the other hand, we're going to have the main partition. All right, so let's go. So we're going to use this utility. It's called lsblk. lsblk shows us all of the partitions or the devices and their partitions. I have an existing install on this machine, and so I'm going to clear it. But just so you know, you can identify here this SDB 28.7 gigabytes corresponding to 32 gig. That was the USB which we used to load the ISO onto the target device. And then here I've got our SDA main disk. So this is the drive, 500 gig SSD that I want to install Arch on, and here it's 465.8 gig. So that's the target, all right? So what we want to do now is use a tool called gdisk, and we're going to refer to that device. So we're going to say dev. So this is the devices, and then we're going to say SDA, and we're going to hit enter. Okay, so now we're in here, we can use the question mark to look at all the available commands. We can see here that we've got a lot of commands, but the first one that I want to point out is L, because we need to format these to a specific type. So I'm going to write L, and now it's going to search for us to search for a string. We want to look at for EFI. So EF00, that is the type that we want to format a smaller boot partition for. The other one, we're just going to use a default Linux, so we don't need to look that one up. But if you're interested, you can have a look at the different partition types. Now, the way that we proceed here is we need to create a new empty table. So if we see here, it is option O, so I'm going to hit O. And it's going to say this deletes all the partitions and creates a new protective MBR. We're okay with that. But remember, the steps that you're taking now, you're going to lose everything on that disk. So be careful. All right, so yes. All right, now I need to create 2 partitions, that boot partition and then the main partition. So I'm going to start with the boot partition because it's the smallest one. I'm going to hit N, and it's going to default to partition 1. Okay, the first sector, it's calculating that where it wants to start. We're okay with this. The last sector, we want to say +1G. Okay, now it's asking us the file system. Now, we just looked it up. We don't want the boot partition to be a Linux file system type. We want it to be EF00. Hit enter. Okay, now we can actually go back to the question mark, and we can see all the commands. And in here, it's going to say, somewhere here, print the partition table. So P, and we can see that we've got 1 EFI partition, and it is 1000 megabytes or one gigabyte precisely. That's great. So now we've got to create a second one, and we're just going to do it with the N command, and it's going to default to partition 2. That's fine. It knows where to start because we already have the partition. And I'm going to hit that. And then for the second bit, I don't need to tell it exactly how big I want this to be because I want to use the remainder of the drive. So I'm going to say enter. Now, I'm going to use the default Linux file system here. And so we don't need to change that. We hit enter, and we're almost ready. The last thing that we need to do is hit W. This is going to write it, and it's going to overwrite the existing partitions, all right? So we hit yes, or capital Y, and it says that it has been completed successfully. Now I'm going to clear this, and we're going to go to lsblk, and you can just verify that you've got your disk that you want to install Arch on, and you've got 2 partitions, one of 1 gigabyte that's the boot, and then the main partition, which is the remainder of the drive. All right, good job. So you've partitioned the drive that you want to install Arch Linux on. And now what I'm going to step you through is encryption, because if anyone ever gets their hands on your device and you haven't encrypted it, then they'll be able to see all the sensitive information that you might have on it. So the way that we're going to do this is with cryptsetup, and we're going to use LUX. So firstly, we know that we want this main partition, which Arch is actually installed on, and which we want to encrypt is going to be SDA2 in my case, so refer to the partition that you're concerned with. And now I'm going to run the command cryptsetup and then LUX format with a capital F. And we're going to point to that, so it's dev for devices, and then we're going to say SDA and 2. Now, it's going to ask you to confirm because all the data is going to be overwritten. So I'm going to hit yes in capital letters. And it's going to ask us for a passphrase. Unlike the passphrase that we created earlier, this is indeed going to be important moving forward because this is going to be the passphrase that you use to access your device. So go ahead and create a memorable and secure passphrase. Okay, the next step is that we need to open that partition, that LUX formatted crypt setup partition, and we need to set up our subvolume. So the beautiful thing about BTRFS is that we don't need to create individual partitions. It will dynamically resize for us, but it uses a system which it calls subvolumes. Now, to get in there, what we're going to need to do is use, once again, crypt setup, and we're going to use LUX open with a capital O. Once again, we're going to point to that same device, so dev, and then it's SDA2 in my case, and we're going to give it a name, and we're going to refer to this during the installation. So, for example, in my case, I'm going to call it main. I don't have any other partitions or operating systems here. You could call it root or whatever you want, but main seems to make sense in my case on this machine. So we're going to hit that. It's going to ask us for the passphrase that we just created. Okay. If we use lsblk here, we can see that we've got the two partitions for the boot drive and then our main partition, and then we've got this crypt, which indicates that we have decrypted, or we've accessed, unlocked that partition. In the next step, what we need to do is we need to format it because we're going to be using the BTRFS file system. So the way that we do that is we're going to say mkfs make file system .btrfs. Then what we need to do is point to dev mapper main. So remember, we just called it main there. So if you called it something else, make sure you refer to that. All right. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to mount our main partition. And in Linux, we use the mnt directory for when we're temporarily mounting something. So we're going to say mount dev mapper main, and we're going to mount that to mnt. Let's cd into the mnt directory. And we've got to do / because we're accessing the mount directory, importantly. So we'll go in there. Now we're going to create our subvolumes. So we're going to use BTRFS for this. So BTRFS, and we're going to say subvolume create at. Now I'm going to use the at symbol to refer to the root subvolume, and the root subvolume is where the operating system goes. Now, it's important, if you're going to deviate from the naming that I'm going to provide here, that Timeshift has defaults that are set up for what I'm doing. So the at being root, and then at home, which we're going to do in a moment, which is the main directory where all your files and so forth are. And so if you do want to deviate, that's fine, but you need to also go away and look at Timeshift, because in the future, when you want to restore snapshots and so forth, that's going to be a complicating factor. So here I'm going to create the root subvolume. And next, I'm going to hit up on my terminal using the up arrow, and I'm going to say, I'm going to create another one. It's going to be called at home. All right. So if we ls, we can see that we've got two new subvolumes inside our mnt temporary mount directory. And so we have created those subvolumes. Now I'm going to go back to where I was. Now, a trick that you can do in Linux is that you can see previously that we were in the home directory as betrayed by the tilde. That indicates that you were in that the root user's home directory in this case. And so I'm going to cd back to the directory that I was in. So I'm going to use cd and then just dash, and you can see that we're back in the same directory. I'm going to clear the screen. We can now unmount that MNT where we created those subvolumes. We use umount, and now we want to go ahead and mount the subvolumes. Okay, so the first one that we're going to do is I'm going to mount the root, and we're going to mount that at the root of MNT. So the way that we do this, and it's important to follow this carefully because this is a fairly long command, but I will explain each step. We're going to use the mount, and we're going to pass some options. We're going to say no A time. That's going to speed things up. Then we're going to say SSD because we're using an SSD. Compress, that's the compression algorithm, which is ZSTD, or Z if you're an American. And then we're going to say, and by the way, ZSTD is the compression algorithm, and it's the same one that ZRAM uses, which we'll be setting up later. We've got space underscore cache equals v2, and then discard equals async, and subvol, so discard async makes things quicker, and then subvol, we're going to be mounting first the root subvolume, okay? And we're going to point to dev mapper main. Recall that's what we called it when we opened up the Lux formatted encrypted partition, and we're going to point to MNT. Okay, now next what we're going to do is we're going to mount the home one, but in order to do that we first need to create it. So let's say mkdir, and now we're going to say /mnt and then home. If we say ls mnt, we can see that the home directory is there ready to mount the subvolume to. We're going to go up on the terminal, and now I'm going to run the same options, except now I'm going to say that the subvolume that I'm concerned with is the at home, and then I'm going to mount it at mnt home. So we've set up the partition which is concerning our main partition, but the last thing that we need to do is just set up the EFI partition for FAT32. So we're going to do that with mkfs.fat/f32, and here we're going to point to SDA1, okay? So recall that SDA2 in my case was the main partition. You can of course go ahead and point to the specific EFI boot partition that was on your system. So we're now going to hit enter. It's made that, all right? And now we're going to create a boot directory in MNT. So we're going to say mkdir and then mnt and boot. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mount the dev SDA1, be careful, SDA1, and I'm going to put that at mnt boot. Alright, so our partition's all correctly formatted and set up. Now what we need to do is install the base packages, and so that we're going to do that with the pacstrap command, but I'm going to clear the screen. Okay, so we're going to say pacstrap mnt base, and this is going to set up with a bunch of base tools and so forth. It might take a moment. Great, so that's all set up. So now what we need to do is we need to generate the file system table. So the way that we do this is with gen fstab /u/p mnt, and we're going to put this into mnt etc fstab. Okay, and we can check that this worked correctly, this command that we just ran with cat, and we can look at that file. And I'm just going to expand this here for you. So we've got the root, and then we've got, oh, of course, we've got the home, so subvolume home setup, and then we have dev sda1, which is our boot partition. This next one is quite an important step, and so we're going to say arch chroot /mnt. So congratulations, because right now you've no longer working on the ISO, which has been loaded into the system. You're now working on your actual own Arch installation, but you cannot restart yet, so don't get ahead of yourself. But nevertheless, it's a big step. So now we're working within our new system. There's a few things that we need to do. All right. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set the locale and the local time zones. So I'm going to say ln sf USR, Universal System Resources, that stands for share zone info, Asia in my case, and then Bangkok. So you choose what is in yours, and then etc local time. Then I'm going to set the hardware clock, so HW clock SYST OHC. Okay, so we set the hardware clock, but now what we need to set is our locales, but we need an editor in there to be able to do that. So I'm going to say pacman SYU, and I'm going to say neovim. So it looks like it's got that available. I'm going to hit yes. All right, so that installed correctly. Now we can simply say nvim, and we're going to say etc locale.gen. Now here what we need to do is we need to search for ours. We can do that with the /, and we need to just make sure that our language is available. So I'm going to say US, and in my case it's this one, the UTF-8 ENUS. So pressed X to delete the hash in front. Now I'm going to do :W. All right, and so that's written, and now we can do :Q. That's going to quit us out of neovim. I've got a tutorial on setting up neovim, so check that out if you're interested. All right, now what we need to do is say locale gen. All right, generation is complete. So now we just need to echo lang equals en. So you copy yours in your specific case dot UTF-8, and all this does is it takes the text which we've got there and it appends it to this file. So etc, and it's called locale.conf. So that the two arrows like that just indicates that you're appending. All right. Okay, so I've set up the locale, but we should also give you an example of doing the key map. By default, it's US, and that's what I use, but I'm going to still show it for you. So it's key map equals US. So before we got the, if you recall, we got the key maps, we got the list. You can do that again, or you can simply just remember what you got earlier. So we got to put this into etc and then v console.conf. Okay, the next step is I'm going to change the host name because I don't want a default host name. I want to call it something specific. In my case, I'm going to be calling it T480, which is the model of the laptop that I'm installing this on. So I'm going to say echo, and I'm going to say T480, and I'm going to put that into etc hostname. So that file didn't exist there. That's why it wouldn't autocomplete. So you could have used a single greater than arrow. Anyway, so call your host name. That's the name of your laptop, right? So you can call it whatever you want. And now we're going to set the root password. So we're going to say passwd. Now, once again, this is permanent. This is the one that you're actually going to be using on your machine. Okay, so we've updated the root password, but it's not always good to always be acting as root, right? So we want to be our normal user, and then when we need to, we want to escalate privileges using sudo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new user, and we're going to do that with the user add command. I'm going to say mg, and then we're going to say users, and we're going to add it to the group wheels. And so my user I'm going to call rad. Now I'm going to give my user a password, passwd. Okay, so we have created a password for the partition, which is encrypted. We've given our root user the password, and we've also created a password for rad. And we added the user rad, or whichever user you've created, to the special group in Linux wheel, which is used for escalating privileges for tools like sudo. But if we want to use sudo, we actually need to add the user to the sudoers group. So in order to do that, in our fresh Arch install, we actually need to create a sudoers directory. The way that we do that is we can make dir, and I'm going to give it special permissions 755. So we put it into etc, and then sudoers.d. Now what we need to do is we need to put the specifics of our user into a file in that directory, okay? So we're going to say echo and then rad, which is the name of my user, so use your username, all. And this goes into etc, and then that directory that we just created, and then the name of the user. Okay, finally we need to change the permissions slightly on that file, so 0044, and then etc, and then sudoers rad. So our user should now be in the sudoer group. Now I'm going to install sudo and a few other tools here. So, well, before we install too much, I'll just install sudo. So pacman install and then sudo. I'm also going to install reflector. I've installed sudo, and I've installed reflector, which is a special utility for knowing the fastest mirrors. So the way that we're going to do the mirrors, I'm going to say sudo reflector, and then I'm going to say C, which is country, and then Thailand, A, 1, 2, sort, we're going to save it by rate, and we're going to save the outcome. There's no space there, it's dash dash save, okay? And we're going to say etc pacman d mirror list, okay? So this will take a moment as it's going to test the available mirrors, and then it's going to save it in there. Okay, so it doesn't have rsync. So rsync is a utility, builds on top of SSH. Let's just install that. And let's run that again. Okay, so it's saved the mirror list, and we can once again use the cat command to go and check that, etc, and we're going to say pacman d mirror list. And so we can see that there's some servers here. Okay, now what we're going to do, we've installed so few packages, right? And we keep coming up against it. It keeps telling us, oh, you know, rsync's not installed or whatever. So we're going to install a bunch of other packages now that we've got the mirror list optimized. So we're going to say pacman syu base devil. So that's going to be some base tools. We're going to say Linux headers, Linux firmware, BTRFS progs for the BTRFS stuff, GRUB, which is going to be our bootloader, EFI boot, and it's MGR, the EFI boot manager, mtools, network manager, sorry, it's network manager -applet, open SSH, that's optional if you don't want to have SSH. Sudo, we've already installed. I'm going to install Git. I'm going to install IP tables /nft for our IP configuration. IP set firewall D as a firewall. Reflector we've already installed. ACPID, which is for the batteries, and then GRUB BTRFS, which is for the BTRFS and the bootloader. So just take a look there, pause if you need to, and I've made an error there, so it was IP tables. All right, now it's going to ask us, we've got, I know that people are increasingly kind of looking at Dracket, but I'm going to just stick with the default, which is 1. Now I'm going to proceed with the installation. Okay, so that installed. Okay, so we have installed a number of critical packages for our system, but there are additional packages which kind of quality of life thing. So we're going to install some. You don't need to install them all, but you can, take my advice that these are useful. So I'm going to install mandb and man pages for all the manuals. I'm going to have text info, blues, which is for your Bluetooth, iwctls, pipewire, alsa utils, pipewire, pulse. Pipewire stuff is all audio related. Pipewire, jack, SOF firmware, TTF, code, nerd, that's just a nerd font, Alacrity, which is just a terminal emulator, and then Firefox, just so that we have a browser. I'm going to accept the default for the font, and we'll let that install. Okay, so that installed correctly. Now, next, you got to determine whether you're on an Intel system or an AMD system. And what we're going to be installing is the microcode so that at boot up time, it can patch the firmware, right? So I am on an Intel CPU, and you just got to check what you're on. But we do this with pacman-s intel-ucode. Now, if you run an AMD system, it's simply pacman-s amd/ucode from memory. So I'm going to say yes. All right, so we've installed mission critical and also quality of life packages, but we haven't installed a display manager. We haven't installed a graphical user environment, and we will get to that. But first, we need to make sure that we can actually log into our machine. So when we restart it, we can actually get into our Arch install. Before we can do that, to make sure it's working with the encrypted partition and also with BTRFS, we need to go and edit our mkinitcpio.conf file, so the config file. So the way that we do that is we write nvim and then etc and then mkinitcpio.conf for config. Now in here, I want you to go 6 down. So that's 6J if you're new to Vim. Basically, you're going to have to struggle your way through the Vim stuff, all right? But I do the video that I mentioned. So now in here, what we're going to say is BTRFS, right? So that's the BTRFS file system. And then also ATKBD. So ATKBD, and we're going to just separate it with a space. ATKBD is because we want our external keyboard to work when we're entering our encrypted password, because I typically work off an external monitor, so that is important if you want to be able to enter that and not with the keyboard on the machine. All right, now we're going to say / and look for hooks, and this is important. We are going to go and we are looking for file system, and in front of that we need to write encrypt. All right, so it is very important that you get the order right, because it needs to load these hooks first. So it first needs to load encrypt and then file system. All right, let's write and close. And now we need to recreate the mkinitcpio file. So we do that with mkinitcpio-p linux. All right, so that image generation was successful, and now we need to set up GRUB for the bootloader so that the system can actually boot Linux. So we're going to run this command, grub install, and the target is x86_64-EFI, and the EFI directory, remember that's where we have our boot partition, is at boot, and the bootloader ID is GRUB. That's the bootloader that we're using and that we installed already. Was fine, and so I'm going to also make a GRUB config. The way that we do that, we say grub mkconfig -o, and then boot, and then grub, and then grub.cfg. All right, so now we need to run blkid to get the UUID for the main partition. So blkid. All right, so we can see here that there's a UUID, and we're going to copy that. Okay, so once we've obtained the UUID, so in my case I had to look up, it's dev SDA2, and then there's a UUID. So grab that and make sure that you've got the correct one. Now we're going to go and edit that GRUB file. And so I'm going to go up here to this line, GRUB command line default, Linux default. And we can leave the first two parameters as they are. And now we're going to say crypt device equals UUID equals, that's where we're going to put the UUID that we just copied. So make sure this is correct, and we're going to call it main. Recall that that's what we called it. Root is equal to dev mapper main. So just take a good look at that, because this is critical. If we get this wrong, our system won't boot. All right, so now I'm going to make that config. So mkconfig -o boot grub.config. All right, so that all worked. We're going to find out in a moment when we restart everything, but so far so good. Let's clear the screen, and let's do one last thing before we restart our laptop. So we're going to enable a couple of services. So we're going to say systemctl enable, and say, and the first thing we're going to do is network manager. Then I'm going to enable Bluetooth. Then I'm going to enable SSHD. And then next we're going to do firewall-d. And then we're going to do reflector. Next we'll do ACPID. we've enabled all these services now, right? And so just means that when we start up, they're all going to be active by default. Now the moment of truth. So I'm going to reboot. So I'm going to exit. That takes us back to, because we were in the Arch root on the installation. Now we're back in the ISO. I'm going to say reboot. Right, so we're going to lose connection to that. And now we're going to move back over to that machine. All right, so now is the moment of truth. You get to find out if you messed anything up during this tutorial. Hopefully not. So you can safely remove that USB. We're not going to be booting into the Arch ISO anymore. We're now going to be booting into the installation on your machine. So I'm going to power on the machine. In a moment, we're going to be presented with the Arch Linux login. So the first thing it's going to do is it's going to ask us what we want to actually boot. And this is the GRUB screen, and it's going to automatically jump into Arch Linux. I think there's a timeout of 3 seconds by default. Now, it's going to ask us what is our passphrase, and we set that up. This is the password for the partition encryption. All right, next we are now in the encrypted disk, but we need to log in as a user. Until now we've been logged in as root, and we will continue to use root to install a last couple of packages, but let's just ensure that our user that we created is working. So go ahead and type in the user and then the password that you created for that specific user. So in my case it was rad. And we're in. We need to connect to the internet. So we're going to use the Network Manager command line interface as opposed to the iwctl tool that we used during the installation. Now we installed the Network Manager, if you recall, during the packages installation. So we can run the command nmcli and then device Wi-Fi list, and this will show all the available Wi-Fi networks. Identify the Wi-Fi network that you want to connect to, and then with the command nmcli device Wi-Fi connect, and then pass the name of the network, Chiang Mai flag. Now at this point you can hit enter and it's going to prompt you for your password. So once you've entered your password, we can just test that we're connected to the internet with ping, and we can say ping archlinux.org, and we can say a count of 5. Okay, we can see that we've got 0% packet loss, so we are good to go. Okay, before we proceed any further, we're going to install a package helper. I'm going to use Paru, and you can use Yay if you want. But the way that we're going to install Paru is using we're going to actually build it. So we're going to say git clone and https aur.archlinux.org/paru.git. All right, this is going to clone it into the directory that we're working from. And so I'm going to say cd and go into the Paru directory. Then I'm going to say make pkg make package /si. I'm going to go with the default, which is Rust, and we're going to go and install. Great, so we have installed Paru, and we can verify that with which Paru. We can see that Paru is now available. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to install and set up Timeshift. So this is so that we can take snapshots and we can restore our system in the future if need be. So we're going to use Paru to install this. So we're going to say Paru S, and then we're going to say Timeshift and Timeshift auto snap. you can accept that, hit enter, and again. All right, so everything has installed. So now what we're going to do is we're going to say sudo timeshift list devices. Let's go ahead and we're going to create a very first snapshot. So we're going to say sudo, and then we're going to say timeshift create comments, and I'm going to put in a comment here. I'm going to say that this is going to be for 12 May 2025 start of time, and I'm going to tag it with D. Okay, once you've got the snapshot successfully saved, we just need to edit the GRUB BTRFS systemctl config. Now, the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to change into the root user. So we're going to do that with sudo su. Now, I'm going to change into the home directory of the root user, and I'm going to edit the .bashrc. So if you see here, if we say echo and then shell, we can see that we've got this bash installed. That's our shell at the moment. And so we need to give it a default editor. Now in my case, I'm using Vim, but you can use Nano or whatever you like, NeoVim. So here, simply what we're going to do is we're just going to say echo, and we're going to say export, and then we're going to say editor equals nvim, and we're going to put it into .bashrc in the root user's home directory. Then we're going to say source and then bashrc. So now we're ready to go in and edit the GRUB BTRFS config file. So the way that we do that is with systemctl edit full GRUB BTRFS, and here we'll be presented with this file. Now I'm in NeoVim, and you'll be in the designated editor that we just set in the bashrc. And what we need to do is we just need to remove the /snapshot. So if we go down here to exec start, I'm going to remove this, the / and beyond, and I'm going to replace it with -t. Okay, and I'm going to write and close. So now we can see we've got this successful installed edited file. So now I'm going to run grub mkconfig-o for options, and that's where we're going to point to our config file. So it's going to be boot and then grub and then grub.cfg. Okay, so that looks good. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to install ZRAM, and ZRAM compresses your memory so it gets more out of the RAM that you've got on your machine. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to install it with pacman, and we're going to say -s and zram-generator. Go ahead and accept, and now we're going to create the config file. So we are going to say mkdir-p. So this will just, the P flag just makes sure that it creates it even if the path doesn't exist yet. So we're going to say etc and then systemd and then zram-generator.conf.d, and then we're going to say vim, that same path, etc systemd, and we're going to say zram.conf. Okay, now in this file we need to input the following information. So zram0, and then we're going to say zram-size equals RAM divided by 2. So this is just by default, I've got 32 gigs, so it's going to give 16 gig here. And then we're going to say the compression algorithm is zstd, as we mentioned at the beginning of the tutorial, and then swap priority equals 100. Okay, so once you've got that, just double check that it looks like that, and you can write and close. Now we just need to regenerate, so I'm going to say systemctl daemon re-exec, and then we're going to say systemctl start dev zram0. Okay, once you've started it, what we need to do, we just need to reboot. Okay, we're back into the system, and so we can verify that the zram swap is working with lsblk, and we can see that half of the RAM here has been designated as the zram swap. Now, it's important to note it's not actually swap, and it deviates from the Arch Linux installation guide. It doesn't actually write to the disk, and is therefore not only more efficient, but using the compression algorithm, it gets the benefits that I mentioned before. We are really close to the end of this tutorial now. The final step is to install a display manager. The display manager that I'm going to install is called ly, and we're going to install it with sudo pacman-s and then ly. Okay, and we just go ahead and say sudo, just like we did with the other services, systemctl enable ly, and then sudo systemctl start ly. Okay, so there's been a lot of suspense. We've been looking forward to getting our desktop environment with Cosmic, which is currently at the alpha 7. The beta has been delayed again, unfortunately. That's software, right? But in any case, Cosmic is going to be a great desktop environment. However, it is still in the alpha stage. If you want to use another one, this is the moment. You could install GNOME, or you could install KDE, whatever you like. Even a titling window manager like Qtile or Hyperland or i3, you can install it. Now, the way that we're going to install Cosmic, though, is with sudo pacman-s and then Cosmic. And this is going to install the Cosmic group. And so we're going to say that we want everything by default all. So I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to take the default. And it is about a gig, right? So it will take a moment, and I'll see you back in just a tick. Okay guys, it's done, and now it's time to shut down the machine, and I'm going to record booting into it. Okay, it's time to boot up the machine again. You'll now see that you've got snapshots in the GRUB menu down here, and you can explore that for yourself. Now I'm going to select Arch Linux, going to decrypt the disk, and here you're going to see the ly display manager. And if you don't see Cosmic, just go up to the top and you can select the one that you're looking for. So you might see shell, just cycle through until you see Cosmic. And now I'm going to enter the password, and there we go. We have successfully installed Arch onto this T480, and thank you very much for joining on this tutorial, and I hope that was helpful. If it was, please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you back on the channel.